Alright, so I've just begun the recording. We're going to be in Mark chapter 8 today, but before we do that, we're going to review the previous chapters, and we're going to do the review in a slightly different way. I've been recently taking a class on the practical teaching of Scripture, so we're going to try some new stuff. I'm only about a couple days into the class, but hopefully the rest of it goes well. So we're going to try some new stuff, and I know it was probably confusing before when we just looked at these different scattered stories. So instead of doing that, we're going to review by looking at where Jesus went. So please save all of your questions for after the review, and you can ask anything about the review after that. So let's look at the first map here. We're in Mark chapter 1, and this is Jesus' baptism and so on and so forth. So we start in Nazareth. So if you look at the map, Nazareth is kind of westward of the Sea of Galilee, a little south. So the Sea of Galilee is going to be one of our pretty much landmarks for this whole thing. So we start in Nazareth, and then he travels southward, a bit eastward, down until we get to the River Jordan. So if you see that first little top bubble there, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. That's Mark chapter 1, verse 9. So that's where he was baptized, most likely in that area there. He travels south, kind of following the Jordan River there, until he gets past Jericho and he is in the wilderness for 40 days. Mark chapter 1, verse 13. So after he is in the wilderness, real quick, he moves back up the Jordan River northward and pretty much back to Nazareth, the Sea of Galilee, and the area around there. So let's look at our next map. We got a few maps here because he runs around a lot. So these next maps after the first one are basically just kind of zooming in on various areas. So this second map here, it starts in Nazareth again. You can ignore the red lines. Those are just the international routes and roads. But the blue line is where Jesus was going. So he's on the move there, over to Capernaum, which is on the north shore of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, that is. So as he's running around, going to Capernaum, he calls his first disciples. That's Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 21 there. So he is passing along by the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon and Andrew and James and John. And verse 21, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. So he went from Nazareth to his baptism and his wilderness trials, then back to Nazareth, and now he's moving to Capernaum there. And they stay in Capernaum for a while and heal a bunch of people and exorcise some demons. So let's look at the third map here. This is just the Sea of Galilee, so nothing new. So he's running around the Sea of Galilee here. This is pretty much the main map for chapters 1 through 6. So all of the stuff around the Sea of Galilee, you see them, walking around near the shore of the sea. This is probably where they are, somewhere around here. So you can see a couple of the little bubbles there where he does things, probably where the multiplication of the loaves was around the Sea of Galilee, both the 5,000 and the 4,000. He heals the demoniac there, the pigs drown in the sea, and that's pretty much chapters 1 through 6 there. And let's kind of zoom in to a different area. Actually, we're zooming out now. So we're zooming out now. And this is starting at chapter 7, pretty much the latter half of chapter 7. So if we move down to verse 24 of chapter 7, we see, and from there he set out and went to the region of Tyre. So if you look at the map there, he's starting in Capernaum, north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Then he moves northwestward through the region of Tyre. You can see those big bold letters for Tyre there. It's a whole region. He's traveling northward even more. He gets to Sidon, and there he is approached by the Greek woman. You can see the first bubble there at the top. This is the Syrophoenician woman with the whole illustration about the children and the dogs. And after that, This is his possible route. So he kind of circles around, going past Caesarea Philippi, going down through the region of Philip, and he gets around in the Decapolis there. Let me check where we are exactly. So Mark chapter 7, verse 31, and again he went away from the region of Tyre, came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of the Decapolis. So the Decapolis region over there is that whole big portion kind of southeast of the Sea of Galilee. Yeah, I'll get to your questions after the maps. We're almost done. So the woman and the dogs, that's chapter 7. Yeah, I know I kind of skipped 1 through 6 because that was all around the Sea of Galilee. So the Decapolis region is southeast of the Sea of Galilee, and that's where he is at the end of chapter 7. So let's move on then. We haven't gone through chapter 8 yet, but here is the map for chapter 8, at least most of it. So you can ignore the dotted red line, you can ignore the dotted green line, and you can focus in on the solid green line for our final map there. So they're in Bethsaida now. They just made their whole circle around from chapter 7, and they've now moved to Bethsaida, which is north, real slightly north of the Sea of Galilee. And then they're going to travel northward there. On this route is where Peter says, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." And we kind of keep on going up to the Transfiguration, which is going to be in the next chapter. But the landmark there is Caesarea Philippi. So if we look at Mark chapter 8, we see that in verse 27, "And Jesus and his disciples went out to the villages of Caesarea Philippi." So that's where they are there, in the village area, not exactly in Caesarea Philippi, but kind of the surrounding area. And that's when Peter makes his proclamation in verse 29. Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ," after Jesus asked him, who do people say that I am? So that's Mark chapter 1, verse 1 to 8. And for Austin's question, let me quickly look through if there were any other questions. Okay, for Austin's question, do you mind explaining the woman and the dogs that you just said? So this is in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30. He's around the region of Tyre and Sidon, and a woman whose young daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit. She heard about Jesus, came down, fell at his feet. She was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by nationality. And Jesus said to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And we looked at the Greek behind that a bit. Yes, it was, dogs could be used as a fairly insulting term by Jews against Gentile uncleanness. However, he uses more of a kind of a, not a bad term, but more of a pet dog term there. And she answered and said to him, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So in essence, she passed this test, and he said to her, "Because of this statement, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter." So we see that Jesus is not going just to the Jews, though he is prioritizing them, while the Gentiles will be mentioned later and afterwards for the whole redemption plan. But he does go to the Gentiles, and this isn't an afterthought or anything like that, because obviously the region of Tyre and Sidon, that's Gentile and Greek territory, and yet Jesus is running around there and helping those people out as he can as a, just a single person. So yeah, Kurt says it is just a loose map of Jesus' travels, and he also goes into many other places. He travels a lot. So just keep in mind, these are loose maps, and the things are not necessarily in chronological order either, but this does give us a real good general overview of Jesus' travels. So one good instance of the non-chronological order is Mark chapter 6, where John the Baptist is beheaded. So we first hear that John the Baptist had died, and then Mark kind of takes a step back and gives us a flashback scenario, flashback scene of how John actually died. So that wasn't in chronological order, for instance. But in general, we get a pretty good idea of kind of what's going on if we follow his travels in Mark. So Sophie asks, is this now sort of where Israel is? I'm not exactly sure. The maps are a bit skewed, but yeah, it's in that area. Not the last map, though. The last map is kind of northward with Tyre and Sidon. So kind of look at the first map, and I don't have any overlays prepared or anything like that. So you can just kind of imagine the first map kind of down a little more. You see Jerusalem westward of the Dead Sea, so that gives you a landmark there. So I don't have any overlays, so maybe next time. Yeah, I'm really bad at geography, but hopefully these maps kind of help with that. So yeah, don't worry about that hat, we didn't hear anything. Alright, so that was the review for Mark's chapters 1 through 7, and a little bit of some spoilers on chapter 8 as to where they're traveling next. So any volunteers to read chapter 8, let's say verses 1 to, how about 21, 1 to 21.
Can do it.
Alright, whenever you're ready.
I'm reading from ESV. 1 to 20. In those days when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he set them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? And do you not remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets... And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand?
Great, so that's Mark chapter 8, and we see a couple little things here. First, we have the feeding of the 4,000, which is very similar to the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6. And then it looks like a slight sandwich here. So he talks about bread there. And then in the middle of that sandwich, we have the Pharisees arguing with him and demanding a sign. And then after that, we have the bottom part. It's not one of the other stronger, clearer sandwiches, but it is a slight sandwich just because this bottom part has to do with bread as well a little bit, and the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples are not understanding here. And Jesus said to them, do you not yet understand, even after all of the miracles that he's gone through so far? So a couple of the themes that we're going to be looking at in chapter 8, especially in the latter section when we get to reading that, is who is Jesus and what should the disciples' responses be? And kind of by extension, what should our responses be to Jesus? So yeah, Kurt says there are a couple of differences. The baskets here are not the same kind of basket. So it's a different Greek word there. They also have different numbers of baskets, different starting foods, and, of course, different people. Different how many people did each feed. So the first instance in chapter 6, we have 5,000, and the Greek term for there is specifically males. So we can imagine from that there were also women and children involved in the feeding of the 5,000. So there were many more than just 5,000. So in chapter 8, the word for the people there is kind of more general and not just specifically for men. So it was most likely 4,000, including men, their females, their children, and, people like that, whatever. And so it was most likely all-inclusive of them. So it was most likely a lot less people than the 5,000, so there's another difference between those two. I only mention those differences because some people think that those are the same story, just kind of changed, but they're definitely not the same story. Many notable differences. For Austin's question, do you prefer we ask questions by typing it out, or can you say them? You can do either one. I'm happy with either. I actually kind of prefer if you verbalize your question, then we're kind of not waiting on people typing things out. For Hat's question...
Well, then why don't you just say so?
Yeah. Hang on, though, if you have a question. Let me answer Hat's first. So the 5,000 men and their families weren't counted in the number. It was only 5,000 men. But here, with the 4,000, it was probably 4,000 men and their families and, anyone else who was there. Did you have a question, Austin?
It's kind of a side question. It's not, super... It's, more of a curiosity. So, in the passage that was just read, he's mentioning how many baskets there were. Is the amount, is the number of baskets and, the amount of food really, kind of the focus? Or is it more so, at the end of the day, Jesus made a miracle. It was a blessing from God. I noticed that he specifically mentioned, how many baskets? 7. And then how many, I think, baskets for the second part was 12. Do those numbers, are they really, anything special? Or is it the fact that the miracle was created?
Well, we could probably speculate a little bit. I would definitely warn about going too far into speculating, but it was probably 12 baskets to represent the 12 disciples. It was probably 7 baskets to, just because 7 is a cool number, kind of the holy number, or so whatever, but I wouldn't go any further than that. The miracle is what's important, showing who Jesus is and what Jesus can do. And that's where I would leave it at.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought as well.
Yeah, so for Sophie's question there, I don't understand the bit about the yeast. Oh, sorry, Jacqueline, I didn't want to interrupt you. But let's take a look at the yeast.
Oh, no, you're fine.
All right, that's good. So let's look at the yeast first. What do you guys think? The disciples are obviously not understanding what's going on here, but what do you guys think is going on with the yeast?
The study Bible that I'm using has a comment about that. So in the New Testament, it says leaven or yeast is usually a symbol for evil or corruption.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think there's only, out of the entire New Testament, just one instance. I think it's in Matthew where leaven is actually a good thing. But all the other instances, leaven is a bad thing.
And just one more part, sorry. But it kind of goes into two different descriptions of leaven. There's a religious side with the Pharisees where they were more looking to their religious traditions, which caused them to set aside God's true commands. And then there's the leaven of Herod, where it represented a worldly mindset that resisted God and demanded a sign from Jesus to prove he was God.
Yeah, I like that. It definitely fits, and we'll get into we already saw the demanding for a sign just earlier, so it makes sense that this is a kind of a continuation of that and why Jesus is warning. So after he gives them, the disciples, this warning about the leaven, they began to discuss with one another, verse 16, that they had no bread. So Jesus was trying to make an important kind of spiritual point here using an illustration, and the disciples over there, what are we going to eat? We don't have any bread here. Even after all of these miracles of the multiplication of the loaves and all of this provision, the disciples are over there kind of focusing on material and worldly things, even though they had Jesus right next to them. So, Jacqueline, was your question something different from the leaven?
I didn't have a question about the yeast or leaven or anything. I think Sophie is the one who had that.
Yeah, I was wondering.
I just wanted to comment about it.
Yeah, go ahead. Or
No,
oh, you
I
already did. Okay,
Just wanted to
gotcha.
read the comment from my study Bible.
Perfect. So Sound asks, are they craving the world? I would say that that's definitely a part of it all. So we see it starts out with a miracle. The Pharisees are demanding a sign from him. You know, who really are you? And Jesus responds, truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Can't remember if it's the same one, but in the other Gospels, you know, except the sign of Jonah, 3 days, 3 nights, things like that. So then he gives them this warning about the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. So keep in mind that the theme is who is Jesus and what should the disciples' responses be. So we see who Jesus is in some of the miracles that he does. We also kind of see the proper response, especially in the first part, the wrong response. That is, where the disciples are not understanding, they're not trusting in Jesus or any of his provisional miracles or anything like that. So let's move on to the last section. Let's say just the whole last half of chapter 8. Any volunteers to read verses 22 all the way to the end there, verse 38?
I'll give it a shot.
Whenever you're ready.
Alright, 22 to 38. Alright, so... And they came to Bathsheba, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of I believe that's Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them not to tell anyone about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of the Father with the holy angels."
That is deep.
It really is. All right, quick summary. We start at verse 22. Blind man is healed at Bethsaida, and Bethsaida is on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. So where they're basically traveling on the east coast of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and going northward until they reach Bethsaida. So he heals this blind man, and then they start traveling even further northward. So if you look at the last map, which is kind of buried in the chat there, but the last map, they're traveling northward now and going to Caesarea Philippi, at least the villages there. Traveling northward, and we we get asked this question, who do people say that I am? And classic Jesus here, he's asking questions, he's guiding them to different answers, he's teaching them rather than simply giving them the answer. Who do people say that I am? They told him, some people say you're John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. And then he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to him, you are the Christ, which is basically the Greek term for the Hebrew Messiah, which just means anointed one. And the anointed ones could be kings, priests, and people like that, and Jesus is over here fulfilling all of those roles, but they don't really know that yet. So they don't know anything further than the Christ, and even though Peter knows that he is the Christ, he still has the wrong view of who Christ is, what the Christ should be doing. That pretty much gets shown in the very next section there, where Jesus is talking about the Son of Man. He is to suffer many things, and Peter, he's rebuking him, but I thought the Christ was supposed to be this, military commander, lead us out from this bondage under Rome and lead the Jewish people to victory and all these military commands. That's what they thought the Christ was supposed to be doing. And Jesus responds, get behind me, Satan, because you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of people. You're trying to take me away from doing what I need to do here. So after that, finally, we see the wrong response that disciples have, and then we see the right response that they should have. Jesus says in verse 34, if anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So we see the right response that the disciples should be having there. So Kurt brings up a good question there. Why did Jesus only partially heal him? Any thoughts on that? Then we'll get to Jacqueline's question after that. So why did Jesus only heal him partially?
Does that have anything to do with faith? What I mean by that is, well, like a lot of times when Jesus performs a miracle, he does it, but he doesn't just do it at the snap of a finger. He kind of analyzes the situation in a way. So I don't know if that means he was like waiting to see his heart's response based on him partially healing him at first. But I know, like in the verse as well, he told him not to even go in the city and tell everybody about it, just to go home and go about your day. Just like later, he was when he asked his disciples who they think he is, they think he's Christ, but he says not to tell anybody, to keep it on the low. So I don't know. I think it has to do with faith.
Yeah, that could be it. Any other ideas? All right. Well, sound is kind of typing there, so faith is definitely a possible answer. Kind of give him the partial healing, see how he responds. Another answer is you could look at it thematically, which means just by the theme of what's going on here, we see basically a partial revelation if we kind of use the blind man's eyes as an illustration for revelation, that he first saw pretty blurry and then he could see even more clearly. And where this story is placed in the theme of Mark chapter 8, we kind of see a similar thing with the disciples, where they're asking, who is Jesus? They're not really seeing very clearly and even misunderstanding some things. And yet as time goes on, they will see even more clearly. Peter says, you are the Christ. He saw a little more clearly there, but he's still misunderstanding some things. And as time goes on, they finally come to a clear sight of what's going on. So that's another answer. Another answer is you could tie this in with some neurobiology and medical studies where Jesus perhaps healed the man's brain first, and the parts that have to do with his seeing and whatever, and then he healed his eyes, or kind of in reverse order of that. Either way, he was healing two different parts of the person. That's another potential answer. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and you can take them as you like, but those are definitely options there. So after that, he says something which might be a little surprising in verse 30, and he warned them that they should tell no one about him. Actually, hang on. That was related, but let's kind of go back a bit. Verse 26, and he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village," talking to the blind man after he healed him. And we see a similar thing in verse 30, where Peter says, "You are the Christ," and he warned them that they should tell no one about him. So it's a theme in Mark, this theme of silence, and we saw that especially in the earlier chapters of Mark, where he's healing people, he's exorcising demons, and then he tells them not to, go around and spread this around. For example, the leper that he told not to spread the word around. Why do you guys think that is? This theme of silence here. Yes, we are practicing silence. Everyone's muted. Yeah, that's one possible answer there. And again, not excluding any other answers, because, they don't have to be excluded here. So Jesus has to go through rejection and suffering because it's God's will. And we could also put in a time aspect to that as well. So if word got out about Jesus, especially as him as the Christ, who people thought at that time was some sort of military commander trying to usurp Israel from Rome's power, that would turn a lot of heads, and people would be very concerned about that, especially the Romans and the people in power there. And so it just wasn't his time yet to suffer on the cross. Another couple answers we see from the leper in chapter 1, let's say verse 44 to 45 of chapter 1. He said to him, "See to it that you say nothing to anyone." Jesus is talking to the leper who he just healed. But, verse 45, he went out and began to proclaim it freely anyway. And because of that, Jesus was no longer able to stay or enter publicly into a town, but he was staying outside in deserted places. So because of the leper ignoring Jesus' commands, now Jesus was not able to go into towns publicly because he was pressed about by different crowds. So we have many different answers to why it's better for silence, at least in these couple instances. In other places, Jesus says, go and proclaim this out freely. In other places, he says, be quiet about this. So that's pretty much the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. After that, we have Peter's confession, "You are the Christ." And after that, we have Peter's misunderstanding of who the Christ is. Peter didn't think that the military commander should be dying and suffering and to be killed or anything like that. He wants victory. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," mostly because you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of people, and you're misunderstanding all that's going on. And Hat brings up a great verse there, Isaiah 53, from the suffering servant passage. "He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed." So this is a great thing to keep in mind, that the Messiah, the Christ, especially at this period in time, is not supposed to be the military commander that people believed him to be. There were other aspects to it. And he's focusing on the suffering servant aspect, along with the whole spiritual battle as well. So finally, after this show of bad discipleship, Jesus tells them what good discipleship looks like, which stems from knowing who the Christ is, what Jesus is supposed to be doing. "If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." The cross, of course, was a symbol of torture, death, destruction, and shame. So it was not a nice, easygoing symbol there. Jesus is asking them some very hard questions here. If you really want to be a disciple, then you got to do these things. All right, any final questions before we wrap this up? All right, let's wrap up with one of my questions. Who here has the list of the 12 disciples memorized? Yeah, that's fine though. I'm assuming that most people don't. That's completely all right. It's kind of my fault as well as the teacher. So we're going to kind of take a more proactive approach to memorizing the 12 disciples. Let's go to Mark chapter 3 as we wrap this up with just a little memorization. So Mark chapter 3, we're looking at verses 16 to 19, and instead of just memorizing the whole thing right now, let's go in with a little slowly. Let's start with the first 3 there. And to Simon he gave the name Peter. So let's just say that the first disciple is Peter. And then we have James and John. James and John are brothers. They're called the sons of thunder. So look at that. I already memorized the first 3. Peter, James, and John. Let's look at the next 3 then and memorize that. So that starts at verse 18. And Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew. So you can remember these with an acrostic, maybe the first 3, P, J, J, Peter, James, and John, and the next 3 with A, P, B, Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew. So Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew. Now I'll give you a minute just on your own. Take a look at those, kind of say them in your head over and over again. Repetition is the key to memorization. Just say it over and over in your head and memorize that. I'll give you a minute, starting now. All right, I'm going to assume that you've been doing that. I have no way to confirm that. But if you did, then you now have the first 6 names memorized. Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew. So that's the first 6. We already have half of the whole list memorized, and I'll keep adding a couple names here and there as we continue in these studies. Does anyone want to close us out with a word of prayer? All right. Oh, I think Hat just unmuted.
If you want.
That would be great.
Yeah. All right. Dear Lord, thank you for another day that we have woken up to. And Lord, thank you for all the blessings that you give to each of us. And let us not forget to be grateful for what you do for us. And thank you, Lord, for the work that Mark puts into the Bible study. And thank you for what we're able to learn about your precious word. And Lord, I pray for all the prayer requests that were given and for any that are unmentioned. And I pray, Lord, that everybody has a blessed rest of their week. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Now, before you guys leave, I have one little thing for all of you. It is a short quiz on Mark chapter 8. So this will help you kind of concrete this information in your heads a little bit for the important bits. And there's a feedback section at the end which will help you, will help me, that is, to make these Bible studies even better. So it's a really short quiz, don't worry. It's like 5 questions. It's all, well, a couple of them are short answer, but most of it is multiple choice. So please take that quiz, cement the information in your mind, and the feedback section will help me a lot in making these Bible studies even better.